Hello, dear friends. Welcome to our short talk today on this heat wave here in Jerusalem. 37 degrees today. That's about 100 Fahrenheit. It was about the same yesterday, and it'll be the same tomorrow. So you know the weather in Israel in the summertime is quite predictable, but this is a very unusual heat wave for us. In this short talk today, I would like to mention a few things concerning Judaism and ethics. I don't know if we'll get to all the issues in this short talk, but first of all, I want to spell out the issues. The first one is the relationship between natural morality, or the ethical sense, the human ethical sense in Torah. The second issue, which is connected to the first, is the place of human reason. Because after all, when we talk about an innate, natural, moral sense, we're talking about something which is connected to human intuition and human reason. And the last question is, what takes precedence? Meaning, when in a person's service of God, is it more important to work on the ethical aspects of life or on what we would call the religious aspects? Or from a Torah's perspective, is it more important to work on the relationship between man and man or the relationship between man and God? Even though the Talmud actually says that there are three relationships in the service of the mitzvot, of keeping the mitzvot, observing the commandments. And the Talmud says, Man debai lemeve chasida, a person who wants to be a righteous person, leilaf mili deavot, they should study the tractate of the ethics of the fathers, because this will help them in their relationship between man and man. And then a second interpretation is leilaf mili de brachot, maybe they should study the blessings, which is their relationship between man to God. And then the third interpretation is leilaf mili de nezikin, they should study the laws of damages. So what's the difference between the laws of damages and the Pirkei Avot? Because the laws of damages are actually my interaction between the other, whereas the ethics of the fathers includes also my own personal moral character and developing my own attributes. So you have three relationships here. The relationship between man and God, the relationship between man, and the relationship between you and yourself in the fact of bettering your own attributes, overcoming anger, overcoming other shortcomings within our own character traits. Now, Rabbi Kook writes in his Musar HaKodesh, which I'm going to quote soon, there are two levels in the Torah's understanding of ethics. There is human ethics, or what we call natural ethics, and there's Musar HaKodesh, what he calls sanctified ethics. You see, in Jewish philosophical literature of the Middle Ages, they broke up the mitzvot into two parts. Part one is called mishpatim, and part two is called chukim. Chukim, or let's say mishpatim, are what I call self-evident laws, meaning the human mind can find reasons for it rather quickly. Not to murder, not to steal, not to commit adultery. We can figure out reasons for it. Unfortunately, the mind can also corrupt reasons, but we can figure out reasons for it if we have common sense and a pure heart. Secondly, you have chukim. Chukim, I call them non-self-evident mitzvot. The Torah commands them, but we have to think about it. What does it mean? Why do we have the Sabbath with its 39 categories of work? Okay, somebody might say, I understand a day of rest is a good idea, but why specifically the way the Torah commands it? The laws are dietary laws of kashrut. Shatnez, not to mix wool and linen together. So the Torah doesn't give us something which is unreasonable, but we have to look for the reasons behind it, because there's a higher ethic, there's a higher sensitivity behind these things. And many people have been trying to figure these things out. And I'm not saying that it's not possible to look for reasons, but they're not self-evident. It's not somebody gets up in the morning and says, maybe I should eat kosher if they were not Jewish. Or that somebody who gets up in the morning and says, now wool and linen, why would I wear that together, right? These are not self-evident, and a person has to think about what the reasoning is behind that. Now, the Pirkei Avot itself brings in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. That's the Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, mentioned in the Passover Haggadah, who at a young age was put at the head of the Sanhedrin. He says, if there is no Torah, there is no morality. Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. The term derech eretz, by the way, in Hebrew, has multiple meanings. Sometimes it means an occupation. In this context, it means ethics. And if there is no morality, derech eretz, there is no Torah. So, what does that mean? Well, if there is no Torah, there is no derech eretz. And if there is no derech eretz, there is no Torah. What does that mean? Morality is innate, but it has to be developed. And unfortunately, it can be corrupted. Because people would say, well, normally I don't steal, but from that guy, from that crook, it's a mitzvah to steal. Normally I don't steal, but the government, they take my money anyhow. Might as well steal from them, a mitzvah. So people look for reasons why to justify, to rationalize things that they might feel is actually not right to do, but, And people can justify anything. In Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, there's a story about Huck and Jim riding on their raft in the Mississippi, and they come across in the summer a field of watermelons, and it's a very hot day. And Huck says, look, let's just take a watermelon. This is wonderful. Jim says, wait, doesn't this watermelon belong to somebody? I mean, this field probably belongs to somebody. What are we, thieves? Huck says, no, we're not thieves. Yeah, let's just put it this way. This field is so big, until the owner of this field will actually find this watermelon, it'll probably be too late and the watermelon will go rotten. So we're actually doing him a favor that we're eating it now so he doesn't have another rotten watermelon in his field. So this is the human mind. We like rationalizing things because we always have this friction between our personal interest and what we know is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. So therefore you need Torah to be the anchor of morality. So the Torah has to say to us not to steal and not to murder, not to commit adultery, even though we probably could have figured it out, and the Talmud says that itself. A lot of things we could have figured out from nature, but it has to be anchored sometimes. Because people have a tendency to reinterpret according to their interest. The second statement is, if there is no morality, there is no Torah. What does that mean? Because the human being is a rational being, or at least, hopefully a rational being, you cannot build a building with the second level before the ground floor. Ethics is the ground floor. If a person can master the relationship between man and man, then they can look for what Rabbi Kook calls the second level, which is called the sanctified ethics, Musar HaKodesh, the ethics of holiness. But if you don't have the first level, the second level is meaningless because the house doesn't stand. So a person who is scrupulous on prayer, on putting on tefillin, on keeping Shabbat, but they get angry at people, they're short-tempered, and they are very arrogant. So they've built the second level, but the first level isn't there, so it becomes a hollow personality. So that's why it says, Im ein derech eretz ein Torah. If there is no ethical sense within that person, then the Torah cannot be built, and the second level will never be able to build. That's why the Midrash says, Derech Eretz Kadma la Torah, which means the ethical practice came before the Torah, because that's the way it was. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivkah, Rachel, and Leah, they all led the ethical life before the Torah was given. So historically, you had the ethical life before the giving of the Torah. And therefore, even when the human being grows up, first they have to understand to be a good person. And then you can build on that. And you can teach them holiness. Some of them will reach it, some of them will not. And now, Nachmanides, one other thing I want to say. Okay, I'll read Nachmanides. Nachmanides writes in Devarim, why is it the Torah says, you shall do what is good and right in the eyes of God? Isn't the whole Torah about doing what's good and right in the eyes of God? Why all of a sudden the Torah says, do what's good and right in the eyes of God? So Nachmanides writes, this is Devarim, chapter 6, verse 18. That's Moses ben Nachman, who died in 1270, lived most of his life in Spain and died in Jerusalem. This is an important idea. Since the Torah cannot mention all human behavior with their neighbors and their friends and all their transactions and social and national improvements, therefore, after mentioning many of them, such as not to take revenge and not to stand by when your friend is hurt and not to curse a deaf person and not to rise before the elderly, the Torah reiterated in general that one should do the right thing. In other words, the Torah teaches us the right thing, but after a while, you got to get it. If you didn't get it, it's a problem. We have an expression in Hebrew, ha-simon nofel. The token has to fall into the slot of the machine for the machine to turn on. So, it's like the story by the fellow who went to the rabbi, says, Rabbi, I went through the whole Talmud, what should I do now? He says, well, you went through the Talmud, but how much of the Talmud went through you? So the question is whether you got it. So the Torah cannot tell us what to do in every circumstance in life. After a certain point, you have to get the point. But how do you get the point? You get the point, first of all, on the level of between man and man by refining your ethical sense. Because the things between man and God, we follow the directions of the halakha, and if we make a mistake, not on purpose, that's why there's Yom Kippur, that's why there's Teshuvah. But between man and man, if you practice character assassination, well, there's very little you can do to stop the damage. First of all, you can try to talk to the person and ask for their forgiveness. But if the damage was already done, you're going to talk to everybody who understood the way you had spoken about before. So it's a much more severe situation. I want to read to you some things that Rabbi Kook wrote in his Orot HaKodesh. It has to do with the relationship with what he calls Yirat Shamayim. Ethics without its source is like an inner light without its surroundings. It cannot last, and its position will dwindle. That's what I was saying before, that ethics has to be developed, but there has to be a divine imperative behind it to give it its objectivity, or else people will use their personal interest to rationalize things. On the other hand, the inner connection to God, when ethical values are not shining on properly, is like a surroundings without a container or grounding. Which means when a person has a connection to God, but they don't understand the importance of their ethical values, then it's also meaningless. As I said, it's like a second story without a first story. And here he calls it's like a surroundings without a center, because ethical morality is natural to the human being. And if we try to stagnate it, to freeze it, we're not going in the way of the human being. I want to read another thing that Rabbi Kook writes in Orto Kodesh Gimel, page 27. In general, Rabbi Kook refers to religiosity, or the religious sense. He calls it the fear of heaven. This is actually a biblical idea, that the fear of heaven, well, in the Bible, the fear of heaven is an ethical fear of heaven. But Rabbi Kook, realizing that in the late 19th and early 20th century, there are people who the fear of heaven, for them, is something divorced of ethics sometimes, so he's addressing this problem. One must not allow the fear of heaven to override the natural human moral sense. The sign of pure fear of heaven is one where one's natural, innate moral sense flourishes. And without it, it would be more compromised. In other words, how do you know if somebody has a real fear of heaven? When it makes their moral sense flourish. And without it, their moral sense would have diminished. However, if one could imagine the fear of heaven in such a way that without its influence on life, life would actually be more inclined to the good and more inclined to achieve human benefit, then this type of the fear of heaven is invalid. If your fear of heaven is about, I'm better than other people, or those are not real people, or if your fear of heaven is, they don't deserve to be around, that's not fear of heaven, that's ego. Don't blame God on your own shortcomings. So it reminds me of a story years ago. The late Professor Pinchas Peli of Jerusalem and Ben Gurion University was a lecturer in the Catskills outside New York when they had the Homo Acts at the time and other hotels. And one time he spoke at a Shabbat program which was for visitors, of course, came in from the city for the weekend. And the owner of the hotel didn't like that people would come to the Kiddush of the hotel and mingle and also eat at his Kiddush because it's only for the hotel people. So he put up a big sign quoting Maimonides about theft and stealing, that is considered stealing if they come to the Kiddush, if they're from the reception, if they're not from the hotel. So Professor Peli walked over to the owner of the hotel. He says, look, if you want to be stingy, that's your own thing, but why are you blaming Maimonides? You know, we always have, okay, I think you got that. Now, the next question is, what comes first? When a person has to work on something, what do you work on first? Well, since something is innate, it's expected. The Talmud says, on the verse in Hosea, chapter 4:17, Chabur atzavim Ephraim hanachlo, which literally is referring to the fact that the northern kingdom of Ephraim is actually involved in idol worship, atzabim. However, the Talmud understands it differently. It says, Chabur atzabim Ephraim, if Ephraim, meaning if the Jewish people are chavur, are united, then even if they worship idolatry, leave them alone. God is saying, I'll leave them alone because if they love each other and they're acting nicely to each other, that's a good reason to forgive them. So the Talmud itself says that for the human being working on the idea of the ethical character between man and man is the first step. So if you got the first step right, even if you fumbled the second step, you could be pardoned. But if you got the first step wrong, how can you be pardoned if it's something which is innate to the human being? If somebody doesn't know about Shabbat, okay, maybe they were never taught. They never learned about Pesach, nobody told them. But they never learned about stealing, never learned about murder. That's like hard argument. It's a hard argument. There, in a book that I've been working on, I discovered an interesting manuscript, which is found in the Padro collection from London. You can find the copy in the National Library. It's questions and answers that students asked Rabbi Chaim Volozhin in the last 4 years of his life. Hopefully this book will be coming out soon. It's called Conversations with Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. And one of the last statements there, Chaim Volozhin makes a statement in the name of the Vilna Gaon. He says, Agra Amar, the Vilna Gaon said, Ikar Amal Shala Adam, which means the main toil or the main service of God, of the human being, should be on transgressions between man and man in all their details. Wow. A halachist, a Kabbalist, master of halacha, master of Torah commentary, he said that the first thing you have to work on are all the details of the transgressions of your shortcomings between man and man, because that's what's holding you back. Because if you want to flourish in Torah, you have to learn to be a mensch. I once heard from the late father of Rabbi Joshua Shviman, I forget his first name. And he said on Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 4, Ben Zoma says, Ezeu Chacham, who is the wise man? It says, Ezeu Chacham alomed mikol adam, who learns from everyone. So this rabbi said, you can break it up into 3 parts. He said, Ezeu Chacham, who is a wise man? Halomed, who learns. If you learn, you can be wise. So the second part you can say like this, Ezeu Chacham, who is the wise man? Halomed mikol, who doesn't learn from just one person, willing to learn something from everybody, because you need to be humble. And then, said the third thing you can learn is, Ezeu Chacham, who is the wise man? Halamed mikol liot adam, whoever, from everything they learn, it teaches them to be a mensch, it teaches them to be an ethical, a more ethical person, more moral person. That means that their limud, that what they have taught, has increased themselves as a human being. And this is the point of Torah. It's supposed to increase our ability to be a full human being. Toda Rabba, Shalom, Shalom.